Hi, everybody, and a very warm welcome to another menopause support information video. So I'm Diane Danzebrink, the founder of Menopause Support and the National Make Menopause Matter campaign. And this afternoon, I am delighted to be able to introduce you to the lovely Amy, who is here from Loch Associates. And Amy is going to be talking to us all about menopause and the workplace. So, Amy, thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat to me. And perhaps you would be kind enough to introduce us to you and tell us what you do.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. A pleasure to be here and to talk on this topic. As you said, my name's Amy White. I am Head of Training and Wellbeing at Loch Associates Group. Loch Associates Group is a firm of solicitors and HR advisors, and we also, under my stewardship, as it were, offer training and wellbeing services to employers and their staff. Our particular specialism has always been employment law, although we are a firm of solicitors that can offer support with commercial, corporate, immigration-related matters as well, should anybody need that. In my role, my focus is delivering training and support to employers and their staff. As I said, I do that from a background of being an employment lawyer and also from having managed an HR consultancy in the past, during which I delivered training to many business owners and their staff. So that's a bit about Loch Associates and a bit about me.
Fabulous. Thank you, Amy. That's really helpful. So Loch have been very helpful to menopause support in providing written information, which is in our resources section of our website, both for employers and employees. So as well as watching this recording, if you want to go back and have a look at some of the information that's been provided, you'll be able to find that in the resources section of the website. So Amy, I think bearing in mind what you've said, it's probably, I have a few questions to ask you, and they're sort of common things that come up, both from employers and from employees.
Great.
So I think it's probably a good idea for me to start by asking you, what is the current legal situation around menopause in the workplace?
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose from a profile point of view, the situation is that it's getting better. The profile of menopause in the workplace over here is increasing and improving. From a legislative point of view, there's a lot of chat at the moment around whether menopause might become a protected characteristic in and of its own right. The protected characteristics being those aspects of people that are protected under discrimination law. There's mixed feeling on that. Some people think that might happen. Some people think it's unlikely, possibly more likely that it will become automatically protected as a disability rather than being a standalone protected characteristic. But I suppose irrespective of where that discussion goes, people going through menopause have options as regards legal recourse. They can make claims to the employment tribunal under age discrimination, disability discrimination, sex discrimination, depending on the facts of the particular situation. So there is protection under discrimination law. In addition, employers have to look after staff health, safety and welfare. They have a duty of care. And that does extend to people going through menopause and making sure that their safety and welfare is looked after in the workplace, and certainly that the employer does nothing to make that worse.
Yeah, so in a practical sense, that's a really key sentence, isn't it? Does nothing to make it worse. I think that's really key in that conversation, isn't it?
Absolutely. And doing things like risk assessments can be a really good way to ensure that you're not doing anything worse, and that any interventions that you're putting in place or adjustments that you're making are there to benefit people experiencing similar things or individuals, depending on the situation.
So in a practical sense, because I always sort of think that if we can approach things in a sort of a simple, practical way, we can get more people on board. So in a practical sense, how sort of in your role, how do you feel that organisations can begin to consider the idea of better menopause support in the workplace?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's thinking about small changes that can have a big impact, because those are the ones that benefit staff most, but also employers find easiest to make. I suppose the first thing to say is thinking about a menopause policy. And I know sometimes people sort of sigh when they talk about policy, but it's a really good starting point because it focuses the mind on what you're trying to achieve. It's a good place for you to put down everything that you're already offering and then spot deficiencies, maybe, or gaps in what you're offering. And then once you publicize or release that policy to the workforce, it's a great way to start the conversation and just even acknowledge publicly that menopause is an issue that within your workplace and within your workforce you're going to have to deal with and provide support for. So as much as I understand why people sigh because they think policies get put in a bottom drawer and gather dust, it's actually a really, really good starting point. But there is that risk that a policy will be written and then not adhered to, and nobody will even know it exists. So unless it's reality, it won't provide benefit. So to make it reality, I think providing manager training has to be the next step, or a step alongside, so that managers know what the best practice approach is to supporting, how they can have conversations with staff about menopause, whether that's one-on-one or with bigger teams or a workforce in general, and the support that their workplace can offer. Because then they'll be the ones that are publicising it and reminding staff of it over and over again. So I think starting with a policy, great to focus the mind, but a manager training is needed then to implement that policy with staff. Alongside that, obviously, there's much broader things we can consider around culture change and building awareness. But again, that policy and the manager training will start that process. And as I say, if you're putting together a policy and you notice gaps in your provision, that's when you can think about the more specific practical support you can provide, whether that's to do with reviewing your uniform or reviewing your working environment, or thinking about extending your EAP to provide a menopause plan. Those practical individual initiatives, I think, can begin with that assessment at policy.
Yeah. And I think following on from that and talking about line managers and, we speak to lots of businesses, lots of organizations. I've done a lot of line manager training. I think, as you rightly say, a lot of it is knowing how to have those conversations, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think the other element of that I have certainly seen is without that knowledge, it's difficult to know what you can offer, what can be helpful. So from your experience, what have you seen that can practically, again, going back to maybe some of those micro changes, what things have you seen that really can be helpful in the workplace?
In terms of what can be helpful, I think having a manager who is open to conversations and has that knowledge, that's going to be the thing that has the biggest change. And it might not be something that's big to change, as it were. Managers can be trained fairly quickly to understand the core concept, and then can go back to their workforce maybe with the question in mind of, what are you going to do now and what are you going to put into practice? They can ask their leadership about the provision that's there, and then they can start being the ones that promote that. And I think in terms of manager training as well, just giving people a structure for conversations is really useful, so that if somebody does come to a manager and says, this is where I'm at, that manager has that confidence and feels comfortable to have that conversation there and then, rather than feeling embarrassed or nervous, or, as you say, just that they don't have the information at their fingertips.
Yeah. And that beautifully segues, thank you, into what advice would you give to somebody who is experiencing menopause and thinking about having that conversation with their employer? So it might not necessarily be their line manager. So first of all, who would you be approaching? And secondly, what would be your advice for how to have the most constructive conversation?
Yeah, good question. So taking it into two parts, I think in terms of who to approach, as you say, it might be that you can approach your manager, your line manager, and you feel comfortable to do so, but that might not be the case. So then it could be the case that you approach another senior manager if you have a different relationship with them, if you feel more comfortable with that. It might be that within your organization there's a menopause champion, or a well-being champion, or even a mental health first aider who you feel may be slightly better placed and trained to have a sensitive conversation, such as the one that you want to have. And in the alternative, obviously, don't forget that HR can help. So if none of those apply, think about going to HR. So hopefully quite a lot of different options for people there as to who they can take that conversation to. And in terms of how to prepare, I suppose importantly, it's not understanding where you're at. So what are my symptoms? How are they manifesting? How am I struggling if I am at work? And how do I maybe think my employer, my line manager could help? And then going into that conversation with that information already thought through so that you can present it clearly. And of course, writing it down beforehand. At the best of times, when any of us are in an interview or a meeting situation, we go along with the conversation and we can forget certain key things that we really wanted to raise. And even more so if you're struggling with a brain fog. So writing things down so that you feel confident that you're going to cover everything off, not get sidetracked, and ensure that you cover the key points that you want to put forward and that are important to you. And I think going in sort of forearmed, as it were, with that information makes it easier for the manager or whoever you're speaking with on the other side to understand what would help you, not what's generic menopause support and what can the organisation provide. Because some of that might be great, but there might be really niche things that in your particular case would be hugely beneficial. And providing that information to a manager is going to really help them on the receiving end.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, is to remember that this is such an individual experience and it can
Absolutely.
be different for everybody, can't it? Now,
Totally.
you mentioned the letters HR
Deep.
as we went through that. So could you tell, because as you said, sort of about writing things down, if you come into a stressful situation, it can be difficult to remember things. So you've mentioned line managers, you've mentioned perhaps more senior managers, well-being champions, you mentioned HR.
Yeah.
So what role does HR play in this menopause at work conversation?
HR play a huge role across organisations, and actually their role just seems to be growing and growing. So
Right.
we do have to bear that in mind, I think. They are the link between leadership and the people carrying out the work on the ground. So from that perspective, they can influence strategy, particularly people strategy or equality strategy within which menopause should really sit.
Yes.
They can also empower networking groups. So that might be a well-being network within your organization or an equality network by, as I say, linking up with leadership and influencing strategy as well. So if you do happen to have one of those networks, then HR are great to get on side because they can have that influence. But on a more individual level, they are obviously there if you need support within your organization because of a difficulty you're experiencing. And they'll also guide managers if issues arise and ensuring that HR best practice and employment law is stuck to as far as possible. So they have quite a broad role within this. They're influencing that strategy. So they might be helping to put together the menopause policy, helping to direct the type of support that will be put in place within the organisation, giving advice to leadership about what that should look like, why it's important to invest in that particular area. But they're also on the ground helping individual employees when they need it.
So that was something that I wanted to cover with you, because sort of in a very real sense, we will sometimes, not very often, but it does happen, that we will get inquiries from people who have attempted to speak to their line manager and it hasn't necessarily gone very well. It hasn't been a very constructive conversation. So in that sense, it would seem to me, and you might say, no, there's another role here, but it would seem to me that perhaps then making an approach to HR to be able to perhaps have that conversation might be the way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're struggling to speak with your line manager for starters, or if you feel you've spoken to them but there's been no resolution or what was agreed hasn't been put into practice, then effectively escalating it to HR is a really good next step because they are across these issues, perhaps more broadly than individual managers might be, particularly if you're in a situation where training hasn't yet been provided. And they can then speak to that manager and see what can be done, or direct you in another direction if that's appropriate.
Yeah, perfect. So we know the world isn't ideal.
Sadly, we do.
But looking at it from both sides, from the individual perhaps experiencing menopause, wanting to have the conversation, from the role of whether it's line manager or HR, and actually perhaps more broadly around the organization as well.
Mm.
What do you think, not necessarily an ideal, but what do you think a good situation would look like from all of those perspectives?
Mm.
What should we be aiming for?
What should we be aiming for? Wow.
Sorry, that's a bit naughty, because I did say to Amy, okay, these are the questions I'm going to ask, and I've kind of broadened that one out a bit, haven't I?
I think that's fine. I just think it's a big question, isn't it? Because we
It
are
is.
in some ways only at the beginning of our journey to making workplaces menopause friendly and to bringing the conversation to the fore. So
Yeah.
I think probably whatever I put forward now, hopefully, might be out of date fairly soon, because the conversation is moving on and our understanding of what helps is moving on so quickly. But to give you an attempt at an answer, I suppose really starting at organizational level at the top, it's around culture.
Yeah.
So it's around creating a culture where there is inclusivity at the forefront, where people feel they can bring their whole selves to work. And that includes health issues that they might be experiencing, such as menopause and symptoms that go along with it. And that they can speak to colleagues and managers about those issues openly, feeling the safety that they will be supported and that they won't experience any sort of disadvantage as a result of that conversation. Rather, completely the contrary. It'll be to their advantage to open up, to share, and that will make their working lives, and as a knock on their personal lives, better.
Yeah.
I suppose that's the organizational level. From a line manager perspective, the ideal is that line managers are trained as a standard in this area, so that they, as I say, feel confident and comfortable having these sorts of conversations, because there's nothing worse than for a manager to feel like they don't know what they're doing. Managers have a huge role as well, and they're expected to cover off all manner of things, technical related to their role, but also people management.
Yeah.
And if they feel nervous and worried, that's a really horrible situation for them to be in. So providing them with manager training is definitely one of the ideals, or one of the big ticks that we would want to see. And then at an individual level, it's ensuring that those things are filtered down such that that individual feels really safe to go and speak to someone, makes those preparations in advance of having that conversation, but feels that like they can do that because they're going to be responded to positively, and action will in turn be taken. And then I guess fitting in alongside those broader things, we love to see practical support. So we like to see things like an employee assistance program in place, so people that need it can access counselling.
Yep.
Or as I say, some EAPs will extend to a menopause plan. That would be great to see. We love to see flexibility in practice. So organizations and managers knowing that if somebody needs a late start, for instance, because they're experiencing sleep disturbance, that can be provided. We like to see practical things around, as I've mentioned before, clothing, temperature of the working environment, provision of cool water, access to rest breaks more frequently. Those practical things that, as we've said, might suit some and have to be tailored to the individual circumstances. Those things peppered across it all would make for something going in the direction of an ideal situation.
And it's often those small changes that can make a significant difference, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. If we're making all those small changes in practice, we're doing something. We're not talking about it. We're taking action, and it's that will shift culture. So as I said before, I can see why people sigh when I mention policy, because making sort of broad declarations about what your organization stands for doesn't mean anything to the staff on the ground unless those small changes are being made in practice.
Okay, so that's the ideal-ish
Mhm.
scenario.
Yes. Yeah.
So moving completely to the other end of the spectrum,
Yeah.
if you have somebody who has tried to have those conversations, who
Mm,
has escalated those conversations and has really not met an open door,
mm,
and kindness and compassion and support, what can they do? And I ask because, again, it doesn't come up on a daily basis, but it does come up.
yeah.
We are contacted by those who say, I have tried to have the conversation.
Mm,
I have actually spoken to more than one person within the organization, but
mm,
actually I'm getting no support. And it won't come as news to you that, of course, we do see quite a significant number of people leaving the
mm,
workplace during their perimenopause to postmenopause transition because of that. So
mm,
where can an individual go? What can they do?
mm.
They've probably worked many years to achieve the position that they have. For many people, they absolutely love the work they do. They really don't want to step away.
No.
So if you have exhausted your sort of the employer resources as far
Mm,
as people that you can speak to,
mm.
what can you sort of practically do? Where can you get support?
Yeah. So I suppose if you're talking about having exhausted the practical resources in terms of you've spoken to your line manager and then you've escalated that to their line manager and maybe you've even got a level above that, as we've said, HR is probably a good next step, because they have that influence and that knowledge, and they may be able to trigger some action to be taken. But of course, sometimes we still find that we're not really getting anywhere. And I suppose in that scenario, employees can consider whether lodging a formal grievance is something that they want to do or feel is necessary in that situation. Because by doing that, you are initiating a process with your employer that they then need to comply with. They need to comply with the ACAS guidance that goes alongside it. So you will have a better idea of what that process is going to entail, the steps that the employer needs to follow, and the employer in turn will have a duty to follow that through.
Mhm.
I suppose if at the end of that you're still dissatisfied, then of course, as we've mentioned before, that there are tribunal claims available, but it's obviously very much dependent on the individual circumstances, and their appetite for litigation and things like that. We can never underestimate how stressful and time consuming and costly litigation is. And as you say, a lot of people don't want to leave and launch into litigation. They love their job. So I think that middle ground of perhaps a grievance where you can make very clear in written form the specifics of where you're experiencing difficulty and where you're dissatisfied, and then hopefully see a positive resolution at the end of that might be something worth considering.
And of course, we hope that people don't have to go that route.
Mm,
But Amy, if they do, where you mentioned ACAS, I mean, is there guidance that people can kind of freely access
yeah,
via an
absolutely.
organization like ACAS for
Absolutely.
a grievance process?
Yeah, ACAS is a really good place to start. There is a whole host of information on the ACAS website about workplace processes and particularly workplace disputes and your rights as an employee, the duties of the employer, and top tips as well if you are thinking about considering lodging a grievance, for example. So yeah, I would always recommend checking out ACAS.
Okay. And so because of the work that you do,
Mm,
um, and because menopause has become so much more of a conversation over
mm,
the last few years,
yeah.
what are some of the common issues that
Mm,
you hear about? Maybe not day to day, but maybe month to month. What are
yeah.
some of the common issues that you hear about, both from both from an employer and an employee perspective around this subject?
Yeah. I think from an employer perspective, I don't know if fears uh, too big a word to use, but I think people are worried about getting it wrong. Employers are worried about getting it wrong. And so that's where we hear a lot of discussion, and that's where we're trying to support our employer clients as much as possible so that they don't have that nervousness, and it's not such a taboo subject, so that they realize actually we can talk about this openly because we now have the information, we're armed with that. On the employee side, we come across a lot of female senior executives who have experienced, I suppose, mistreatment, and that has had a huge knock to their confidence and their sense of self. I think sometimes we forget how much of ourselves is wrapped up in the work we do, whether it's the position we've got to or the services we provide. And if that takes a knock, it has a really significant impact on our sense of self. And the reason that the female clients in this case that we're working with feel that way is often not something they've imagined. It's often because having opened up about menopause, maybe change their working pattern to accommodate it at their own decision, things around them begin to change, whether that's their involvement in managerial meetings or being on certain circulation lists. So I suppose it can be small things, but they can have a big impact. So I think that's a trend that we've seen coming through. But obviously the goal is to overcome both sides, because if we can tackle the nervousness and the sort of unwillingness to understand these are the sort of symptoms, this is how it might manifest at work, but this is how we can help overcome it, then hopefully we won't be seeing the damaging impact on women in this case on the other end.
And it's a win-win situation ultimately, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The employer retains their amazing talent,
Mm-hmm.
and the talent gets to carry on doing the job that they love.
And at the moment, when there's such a talent shortage, employers can't afford to lose senior people who have got this whole lifetime of information and knowledge and industry knowledge to contribute, simply because, as we've said, maybe small steps aren't being introduced that could really change the outlook.
So this sounds a little bit negative, but it's not meant to be negative. It's just meant to inform people of where we are. Where are we with case law regarding menopause? Because a few years ago, so when I first started sort of speaking about this, raising awareness about this, sort of back in 2015, there was not a lot. But in the last few years, there has been some case law around it. So so where are we?
We are seeing a considerable increase in cases that mention menopause, or whether that's within the claim form or later documents that come along. I think it's gone up by 44% year on year. So we're really seeing an increase in it. And as I say, it links to certain types of discrimination mostly. So age, sex, and disability. Within that, the sort of trend that we're seeing, certainly where disability is concerned, is for the courts to be willing and open to agreeing that menopausal symptoms can satisfy the legal definition of disability under the Equality Act.
Can you remind us what that is?
So a disability at law is a long-term, substantial mental or physical impairment that has an adverse effect on an individual's ability to carry out day-to-day activities.
And am I right? Is that more than 12 months?
The long-term, generally speaking, we would be looking at that. But like with everything, it is case by case. But yes, there are some common themes that run through that definition. And the courts, when they're thinking about disability claims, want to know whether a particular condition that's been put forward satisfies that definition before they'll move on. And the courts have shown a willingness to do so in relation to certain claims brought in connection with menopausal symptoms. So I would say that's a positive, particularly thinking about the fact that some commentators are suggesting it's not likely menopause will become a standalone protected characteristic. In relation to other areas, again, there's a willingness, whether it's related to age or sex, for findings in favour of claimants who are putting forward cases that relate back to menopause. We've seen cases where age is concerned, where Female employees were referred to as dinosaurs, and their mistakes were blamed on menopause. We've seen them be successful in their age discrimination claims. And we've also seen success for younger claimants. In one case, for example, a female employee who was having to go through early menopause as a result of cancer treatment was successful in a claim when she was told it was no big deal that she was going to have to go through early menopause and therefore lose her opportunity to have children.
Wow.
So again, a willingness to find in favour of claimants in the right circumstances. So I think that's a real positive because it shows people that there is protection there. But obviously, as we say, getting to that end point is the difficult bit, and that's difficult in all manner of ways. The stress, the time-consuming nature of it, the finances.
You know, what you've just said about the response that she got to what she was going through has actually made my heart beat faster, because I think that just shows us still how far we have to come with the understanding of the whole person experience.
Absolutely. And I think when we think about things like policy drafting, this is why I say what I might say about an ideal world now, we might think better about it in the future, because we're really only now beginning to grapple with the fact that it's excluding if we only talk about naturally occurring menopause.
Yes.
Actually, we need to make sure that we're dealing with the whole scope, whether that's surgical or medical, as well as naturally occurring. We need to think about the fact that it's not just limited to women, and be much more inclusive in our approach to things like policy drafting. So
absolutely,
yeah, there's still a hugely long road ahead.
So Amy's mentioned surgical and medical menopause there, and she also mentioned early menopause. So just for anybody that doesn't know, surgical menopause happens to somebody who has had both of their ovaries removed at the same time. That puts them into an immediate surgical menopause. Medical menopause can happen for several reasons. It could be treatment for a certain medical condition. It could be about having medication to have the ovarian function suppressed because of another medical condition. Early menopause is menopause under the age of 45, and premature menopause is menopause under the age of 40, and currently happens to around 1 in 100 under the age of 40. So bearing in mind the size of some organizations is not rare. But I think, you know, kind of what you said about that response to that particular individual really shows that there is a real lack of understanding, not just of the physical impact, but also the psychological impact.
Absolutely.
You know, particularly around for a young woman and potential fertility, having to use medication for perhaps much longer than they would ever have expected to. The idea that for some they might be in menopause before their own mother. So I think, you know, kind of it does show that we do have, as much as we think we've moved forward, and we definitely have, it just shows how much we still have to do, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that's why I mentioned earlier on things like mental health first aiders, because we can't underestimate the, as you say, the psychological impact of this. So having those sorts of people within your organization as well, who can provide that mental health support is crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for your time. I have one final question for you, and then I'm going to ask you if there's anything else that we haven't covered. But my final question for you is, what would be your top tips, both for those who are experiencing any type of menopause, any stage of menopause, but also those who are employers, line managers, etc.? What would be your top tips for them?
So for those experiencing menopause, I think my top tip is to communicate, because the only way you can access support is to explain the situation that you found yourself in. And I completely understand the apprehension to do so. Not only is it an intimate and personal thing that you're proposing to discuss, but also there may be that concern that there won't be a supportive reception. But as we've talked through today, if that worst case scenario happens, there are options available, but you're not going to access any support if you don't communicate in the first instance. And given the shift that we're seeing in attitudes, my real hope is that actually you will be met with support, and that things can then change, and you don't find yourself as somebody that's having to exit the workforce because of the severe symptoms you're experiencing, but actually you can continue to provide your talent to your organization for many more years and get the benefits that we all get from work, which are huge. On the employer side, I think it comes back to what we said before, which is sort of starting small. Don't feel overwhelmed by it. Don't feel like your whole organization needs to change or you all need to become absolute experts. Actually, doing something is better than doing nothing. And starting small can have a ripple effect. So it might even be sort of looking at what you've already got in your organization. You might already have mental health first aiders. That would be really helpful for people to know that they're there and they can be contacted. You might already have an EAP, but you might not know exactly what that provides and how that can help people that are going through menopause. You might have within your organization people that are willing to be menopause champions or peer support, who are willing to share stories, because we know how powerful storytelling can be and how powerful seeing people in positions of authority being vulnerable can be, and opening up. So those aren't things that are maybe hugely costly. They don't actually require a massive culture change or a change in policy and procedure, but in practice they would have really, really big benefits. So don't be overwhelmed by it. Start small, but start.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that what probably two of the most important things that we've seen over the last few years is that gathering together. I mean, admittedly, for a lot of people for a couple of years, they weren't able to do that
Yes.
because it all had to be done online. But more recently, sort of having those menopause support groups within the workplace, that peer support,
Absolutely.
and so many people being willing to come forward and say, I would like to be the menopause champion, because they just don't want to see colleagues go through what they've experienced.
Absolutely. It's so
But
important. It really is so
absolutely,
important.
yeah,
And we see it
100%.
across the board. Well-being networks,
Yes.
um, equality and diversity networks. We see how successful they are. And the same goes for menopause as well. That, as you say, that community where you're going to find help and support.
Yeah. Thank you so much for
Thank you for
taking
having
the
me.
time to talk to me. So, Amy, can you just quickly tell us, for people to find Loch, what are they
Mhm.
looking for when they go online?
Yeah, so if you Google Loch Associates Group, you will come to our website. Our website details our different service areas, as I say, legal, HR, training and wellbeing. We also offer mediation should anyone need that. So all the information is on the website, including on our events page, information about our upcoming training. We are actually running training on menopause and mentoring fairly soon, just a free webinar for people to attend and get some ideas from. So it's
Perfect.
all there on the website.
That's brilliant. Lovely. Thank you so much. So, everybody, I hope that you have found that helpful. As Amy said, you can find Loch Associates by having a little Google for them. I shouldn't have said that. I should have said other search engines are available, but hey, it's out there now. And as I said, Loch have very kindly provided some written information for menopause support, which you can find on the menopause support website. And this video will also be available there. So it's menopausesupport.co.uk. And I undoubtedly will be back doing more of this in the not too distant future. So thank you again, Amy. Really appreciate your time.